watching anyway.
All right.
Have you turned it on yet?
Are you turned on yet?
I'm getting there.
Oh, good.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to What the Hell is Water?
This is the creepiest intro we've had yet.
I take that as a compliment.
Yeah.
You know, there's many things that people strive for. Creepy intros should be one of them.
Why not? I mean, creepy on the outro means you might have nightmares later. So we try to get it all over with in the first, 30 seconds.
Yes, nice to finally see all of you. We've been tracking you for a while now. Oh, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
How are you doing, Ryder?
I'm good. It's nice to be back on the couch.
Yes.
Sounds like a therapy session. Maybe we should start another podcast.
Just lay your little head right here. We'll solve all your problems.
I don't want them solved. I just want to talk about them.
We'll rub salt in them.
Endlessly, ad nauseum. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to have you back. How was your week afar in the land of humidity?
Oh man, it was epic. Well, not really.
Cue the music.
Dun,
Dun, dun, dun, dun, dun, dun, dun, dun.
Just worked my tail off, and it was. It's always kind of interesting. I really like making things because I can immediately see the results.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many things we do in our life that you work forever on, and you don't know if it's going anywhere or going to get you anywhere. But there's something about manual labor and construction. At the end of the day, you go, "Oh yeah, I built that."
Oh yeah, indeed, and I know exactly what you mean. And I gotta say that for those of you out there who are wondering, is Ryder a really open guy? You heard it here first. He actually wore a tail for a while, but then he worked it off. So it's up to you to decide if you have any issues with that. But was it furry? Was it long? Was it short? Was it stubby? Did it vibrate?
Well, if you do some deep internet trolling, you might find
it. So here's your challenge for today. See how long you can spend Googling Ryder's name and tail and come up with pictures.
Yeah, why not? We'll see what we have on the show tomorrow.
Yeah, of course. You never know. Well, yesterday we talked about maintaining your tone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because mine's a little pale right now.
Yeah. I
these winter months.
Talk to you about that.
Yeah, you've been looking real pale.
Serious
You need to get you some sun. No, we talked about tone of voice and also a little bit about parks as well. And with the tone of voice, we were talking about how it's something that isn't the easiest to recognize that you have, but it has a huge impact on every single one of your relationships, probably.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how it's like a life skill to figure out when and how to sort of turn your tone on or turn it off. And we sort of toward the end, we even talked about what role you're in and how your tone will change according to what role you want to be recognized in at various points, right? So you can go from buddy to manager in an instant just by changing your tone.
Good cop, bad cop,
yes,
mediocre, average cop, whatever.
Yeah, I know. Lackadaisical cop.
Yeah. Furry with the tail. Yeah, sometimes you gotta know.
That's a weird fetish genre.
I bet if you use that voice that you use all the time, it'd pair nicely.
That
furball cut in the throat.
Yeah, I did. Actually, I think that was my morals and
okay.
stuck in there. I can't do it.
So when we're talking about controlling tone, so the first thing for me that came to mind was talking about sarcasm or anger, but those are just a couple of the types of tones, as Ryder was alluding to. I mean, if you're trying to encourage somebody but give them a little bit of feedback, you might want to have a different type of tone. If you're trying to chastise somebody for something bad they did, you might want to have a different tone. And these are some areas and times where you maybe are intentionally thinking about your tone, but maybe you're not. There are certainly plenty of times where you're probably not thinking about your tone, and those are the more kind of everyday interactions with maybe your partner or a friend or family, or just a random phone call or something like that. Or as we talked about, also over text or email or something like that. And not only do you have to be curious and aware of what your tone is as you're typing, but also running through what some of those tones may sound like at the other end for someone who has no other context, right?
Yeah, and I think it's almost instinctual. The interesting thing about it is it controlling your tone feels like to me controlling your emotions, because tonality does seem to be emotional. We talked about if you could read the transcript, it might look really neutral, but depending on your tone, you can give it different inflections, and all of a sudden somebody can be offended, or they can find it as funny, and so there's a lot of things there about this kind of also ability to like not blow up, like handle your emotions when you're feeling that sarcasm, like let people know there's a joke coming, and sometimes your tone can do that for them.
Yeah, I've started actually before I deliver a punchline, I just go, "But," and then everyone's like,
Before?
"What?"
I like
And then I'm like, "Joke." And they're like,
Are
"Oh,
you ready for this?
Dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. Are you ready for this?" That's what it made me think of.
Oh, I missed it.
Yeah, you didn't hear your tone.
No.
See, that's how easily it can happen right there, ladies and gentlemen.
Stone cold tone deaf.
Yes. So yesterday we talked about tone, and we also talked about parks. And one thing, I don't want to get into a huge side tangent on it, but I definitely thought a little bit more about parks a little later. And one of the things that I thought of was, one, how last week, having a dog has been a great way for me to discover walking. I'm not even going to say rediscover walking, because I've always been about efficiency and things like that. So in college, even I bought a bike so I could get around quicker and get fast from my spot to my class and get there as quickly as possible and still arrive late, because that's what I'm good at.
That's what I was just thinking. I was like, Reed is so efficient, he's always late.
Oh yeah, I had that 8 a.m. class, and they had a pop quiz, and I would show up sometimes in the middle of the pop quiz.
Nice.
Yeah. Still popped it though, so we're good. And then, but anyways, so my point was it was nice to discover parks now because of my dog. And you got to walk them. Living in an apartment, you don't let them go, and I don't let them go in my apartment. Maybe some people do. But so doing plenty of walking. And the other day, Danielle and I, my wife and I, went on a walk, and we went to that park over there, the one we were talking about, the larger one, and it was nice. We walked over for a while, and then we sat on a bench and we read, and it was good weather, and it was very pleasant. And it was like, that's not something where even now as I describe it, I'm not like, oh yeah, that's awesome, I should totally do that more often. But it was very nice. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's a overstimulation that we're probably fighting against all the time. But overstimulation is also fun because it's stimulating.
Right. Yeah.
So parks don't do that.
The other thing I wanted to point out with it was that it's free. I don't think we mentioned that yesterday. I mean, at least most parks, right? They're a free thing you can do. And I heard something said about public libraries the other day. It's like a public library is one of the few places you can go in public now to gather with other people for free. And the park falls in that kind of wheelhouse as well. It's like, okay, you don't have to go to a restaurant. You don't have to go to a bar. Like, you can go somewhere and you can hang out with people. You can maybe even, especially a lot of parks have picnic tables, pavilions, coverings, things like that. You could go grill out. You could go hang out. You could go read a book, pull out a picnic basket,
Picnic.
Yeah.
Yeah, or, if you're really, hard up, you can go to the post office, hang out there for a little bit.
For sure.
Lots of places you can go.
Just stand to the side of line and offer to lick people's stamps. And see how long people take to tell you they're self-adhesive now.
Tips. Yeah, see what?
It just licking stamps here.
These are self-adhesive. I'll lick it anyway.
I like the taste. So that was tone in parks for us, and we had a little bit of a a 2-tipped challenge yesterday, and one of them was to go to a park, especially if that's not something you had done before or done in a while. And then the other one was to have a conversation with someone about your tone. And hey, who knows? Maybe that is on a walk to a park or something like that, or maybe they meet you there. And so for those of you who have not taken that challenge yet, I strongly consider you to go do that. And some of our guidance on that was start with a question. Start to open the conversation and say, hey, I've been thinking a lot about tone. We just watched this really cool episode of What the Hell is Water. You should totally check it out. And wanted to talk.
Say that with an excited tone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, when you get to that part.
Yes, very excited. I watched an episode of What the Hell is Water, and it was amazing.
It was so good.
Yeah, so good. You should totally watch it.
Oh my
God. And then, don't immediately go and say like, hey, friend, you've got a tone problem, right? Be like, hey, I've been thinking a lot about tone and paying a little more attention to mine. Like, what do you think about mine? Are there some things that you think are good or bad about it, or times where it gets out of hand?
I like this. Like, open it up, let them punch you first, and then you get to punch them back.
Exactly.
I think that's how friends do it.
Twice as hard, though.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So you saw through our ruse. Well, I think that was pretty much the recap for tomorrow. So let's go ahead today, rather. See, I'm already in the future. Let's go ahead and jump to our intro. Helpful for life. All right, welcome to What the Hell is Water. Today is January the 19th. And it is Wednesday. Hump day. And we today are going to be talking with our lovely repeat guest, Alexandra Merakinos. And we're going to be talking a little bit about leveraging the expertise that you gain through your studies, through your work.
You said Alexandra Mannerings.
Oh, I did. Oh, well, we'll find out what that means in a second. Oh, man.
Mystery.
Man, last name is a made-up word? Oh, weird. Who's this lady? But yes, today we're going to be talking a little bit about how you can leverage the expertise you get from maybe your studies, maybe from your work, and maybe those two things are completely different. Who knows? But how do you leverage those into your everyday life? Yes, a lot of us work at some point in our lives, and a lot of times that takes up a good chunk of our lives, but there's still a lot of other life that we have every day in our daily interactions with others, around our house, when we're going shopping, when we're browsing, when we're consuming media. There's all sorts of situations we find ourselves in, and sometimes it is advantageous to use those skills that you gained from the workplace or elsewhere in your everyday life to make things a little better, cheaper, stronger, faster, whatever you want. So without further ado, let's jump right on over to our guest, Alexandra Mannerings from the company Merakinos.
I mean, if we're honest, aren't all last names made up?
Yes.
I mean, I just up and changed mine, partway through my life. So
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Well done. So good morning. Nice to see you. I realized I was muted and my camera was off there for a second, but we're back now.
Yeah. Speaking of last names, I've got a friend whose last name was Rifle, and then they got married, and it turned into Outlaw.
That's
like amazing last names.
That's pretty good. I had a friend whose last name was Funk, and they got remarried to the Moores, and they decided to hyphenate. And not only that, but they spouse swapped. So then we had the Funk Moores and the Moore Funks, and I'm like, that's pretty good. And you had to also admire that they know what they're doing. And they're still doing it.
I do like the Moore Funks.
Yeah.
Wait. Yeah, this is so strange.
So Alexandra, how have you been the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I'm surviving. I had a ridiculous sinus infection that surprisingly was not COVID, but still managed to lose my taste and had a ridiculous cough because it was such a bad sinus infection. But we're surviving.
Well, that's good. And it's good to hear that there are illnesses other than COVID out there still,
exactly.
Right?
Well, and it's funny because I feel like that people have kind of forgotten that. And so they're like, oh, well, it's not COVID. You're like, but I still feel terrible. So
Yeah, but you can still work, right?
right, exactly. Like, and I'm still contagious. Like, other things spread too.
It's just COVID. You could go ahead and tell us,
Yeah.
Alexandra. It's fine.
This
No,
is a safe space.
I was surprised. I got a PCR test and everything, and it was not. So
Well, glad to hear that you've either worked through that or almost through that. Yeah,
survived it.
yeah, that's good.
But
Well,
I was laughing listening to your discussion about tone because my 5-year-old has just figured out sarcasm,
nice.
and it's really funny because I was driving and I think somebody cut me off, and I was like, "Oh, thank you very much for doing that." And he looked at me and he was like, "You don't mean that." And I was like, "You're right." I was like, "I was being sarcastic." He's like, "Oh," and I was like, "Sarcastic is when you say one thing but you kind of mean the opposite." He's like, "Okay." And then like 5 days later, his sister took something of his, and he was like, like, "Oh, I'm so glad you took that." He goes, "Mom, I was being sarcastic."
I like it. That's great.
And the funny thing is, he doesn't get the tone at all, so
Right.
he'll say it exactly like everything else, but
Well, one of the
he
things we
means
said
the
yesterday
opposite.
was, there's definitely a place for the deadpan humor.
Yeah, the
So-
super
Oh, and
dry. Yeah.
That's true.
I gotta say, once I
welcome to all of
discovered British,
humor.
once I
Yes.
discovered British comedy, I was like, my
Yes.
friend, it's good to see you.
Yes.
Well, one of the things, not one of the things, the thing we're going to be talking about today is leveraging your expertise in your everyday life. And, we've already had you on a handful of time, and sorry for calling you Alexandra Merakinos. Maybe you'll change it again for a marketing stunt later on.
Just
Who
for
knows?
fun.
But yeah, we've already had you on a handful of times about some ways that people can use data analytics and that type of thought process and critical thinking as they're looking at headlines, as they're trying to decipher science in the news. We even talked about creating a living will, an episode a while back. So we've covered a lot of things with you, and those arguably are ways of you applying your skill set to quote unquote real life or non-work life. So as we were thinking about what wonderful things you could grace us with, we thought that would be a fun conversation. So whenever I brought up that topic, did some things immediately jump to mind, or were you kind of like, I don't know?
Well, it's funny because, of course, for me, the work that I do and how I think about the world, professionally is hard for me to separate how I think about it personally because they're so similar, so integrated. And part of that is because of my ridiculous family that I grew up in. I joke. So I have a younger brother and my two parents, and 3 of us have PhDs, and the one who doesn't works for NASA. So we're
nice.
not an average family.
I gotta ask, do y'all give that brother a lot of crap for not having a PhD?
Oh yeah, it's
good.
basically like Big Bang Theory, right? Like the rocket scientist, right? The dinner table discussions have never been, I don't think, normal for me, and I think it shows in a lot of the ways that I think about the world and how I'll respond to things. And some of them are really funny and small. Like, for example, I was thinking about the weather. My husband had the news on, and it was talking about the weather, and it was saying, there's like an 80% chance of snow. And I realized that most people, if it doesn't snow, they'll be like, "Oh, the weather people got it wrong."
Right.
And I realized I don't. I'm like, "Oh, okay, it was the 20%." And it's a subtle thing, but it's a big difference in understanding what probability really means when you're trying to guess something that is truly unknown, right? There's a difference between not knowing the future and the future being unknowable. And weather is truly unknowable for to complete certainty. And so we can make really good guesses. And there, if you look at it, if they say 80% chance of snow, they're right almost 80% of the time, which means that they're almost perfectly accurate, right, in predicting the likelihood of snow. But there's this
right,
level of
80% the
unknowability,
time, which is impressive. Hey, we're telling you the future for tomorrow correctly 80% of the time. People should be.
Well, what
happy
I'm
about
saying
that.
though is that they're getting the probability 100% right, or nearly. Right? But the thing is you can't actually know for sure what's going to happen.
Yeah, when you say 80% and you nail it on the long end, that's great. Like that, you're 100% accurate. Yet because we're not saying 100%, people do not think it's actually 100%.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's a funny little loophole.
And we just as humans have difficulty with living probability because you only get to live one outcome. And so you're like, well, and what happened was this, so therefore that's the truth. And if you didn't guess that, then you were wrong, even though you might have had like if you could run the universe an infinite number of times, like you would have nailed the probability of how many, it happened in each of the different versions of the universe. So I thought that was just kind of funny of like, it's a small thing, but I realized that it does reflect a lot of, I deal with probabilities and risks and percentages so much that that's a very easy thing for me to understand, but it's not a very common way of thinking about it.
Well, I wanted to make sure to point out the most important thing in that whole discussion, which was it actually snowed here in Dallas. There were
Very
some
cool.
flurries on Saturday.
Most important thing.
It was at least a couple grains of salt.
This is 100% important.
Accurately predicted. Accurately predicted. So no, I think the weather is a great example, right? And dealing with statistics and if I had $1 every time we sat on the show, it's a subtle shift, but it's a very important one. We would have $100 million.
Well, we would have $2.
Okay,
but
$2.
Yeah, it's only when you're on the show that we talk smart like that. The rest of the time. So,
go ahead.
Oh yeah, like I was thinking, like the weather is an interesting one, and then there's like, I mean, what happens when, I don't know, like we talked about being in the grocery store before and how like that handles like when you get into your basic kind of consumerism, how this kind of statistical modeling, or it's not even statistical at that point, maybe it's just basic math, but yeah, like are there any other kind of things that pop up for you whenever you're just sort of like moving through the world, and they might be so common to you that you don't even think about them now,
Right.
but they might be amazing to read and I.
Well, the one that I'm constantly running into when I talk to people is cause versus correlation. And I will say this like 1,000 times and over and over again, is like there is a difference between things being associated and things being causal. And as humans, we are wired to find causality, right? We really, really like saying this thing happened and it made this other thing happen. Because when you live in the savannah, right, it's actually a benefit to be like, I heard the rustle in the bush and it was a tiger. And so therefore, like the tiger caused the rustle. So the next time I hear a rustle, I know it means tiger. Right. And so we like put that causality together really, really easily. But now in our modern world where we have such a reach of knowledge and like experiences, and we can see all of these incredibly complex phenomena, we have a tendency to still apply that like simple causality to things that are not that simple. And so the number of times that somebody will be like, I mean, a lot of the times it'll be like cancer, like green M&Ms cause cancer. And I'm like, okay, no.
But they're combated by chocolate and wine, so we're good.
Right, exactly.
Right. 3 cups of black coffee.
And if you look at the studies, they'll say we looked at a group of people who ate twice as many green M&Ms as this other group of people. And the group that ate twice as many green M&Ms ended up with, 5% more cancer incidences than the other group. That's all the study says. And we immediately go, and therefore green M&Ms cause cancer.
Yeah.
And like there's so many interesting logical fallacies with that jump, but it's what we all do. And like I'll catch myself. I still sort of have that instinct, and then I'll be like, hey, let's roll it back and actually look at like what's going on here. So I mean, like one of the really common causes of this is that there's what's called a confounding variable, meaning there's something else that's driving both of those things. Mm-hmm. So it could be that like if you smoke, it also makes you like green M&Ms. And so it's actually the smoking that drives both the green M&M choice and the cancer. Yeah. So like that's a really common one that you'll see in all sorts of different things. Or it could also just be coincidence. Like depending on the size of the study, it's just random chance. And we've talked about that a lot on other times that we've come on. And then sometimes systems are just complex. And there's such an interplay that like you might have teased out one little piece, but that's not at all the actual story.
So the bottom line is eat all of the colors of M&M to cover your bases.
Yes. And then you're going to be okay.
100%
That's exactly
of the time.
While smoking.
Yes.
I thought I caught that in there too. No, there are other, the thing about this, the rustling of the leaves, right? And the tiger jumping out is like 99.99% of the time, the leaves will rustle, but no tiger will jump out. So there's also this like fear bias, right? Or survival bias that shows up there. So this kind of causation effect is things that I think theoretically or evolutionarily, the idea is that these are things that can save us, and we weight those so much more heavily than we do other things.
Right, and I think it's worth pointing out that the more anxious of a person you are, the higher that weighting is, and not only the more anxious of a person you are, but this is the thing that was a transition for me. It's like thinking like, oh, well, I know this person and that person, they're anxious or they have anxiety. Well, no, we all have some amount of anxiety that varies a lot based on the situation you're in. Like for me, for example, when I was working and living my white collar job in LA, like my emotions were pretty even keel. But then when you move into an RV and you take away the steady income and you're changing all these things all the time, your situation becomes a lot more stressful, or maybe you introduce a global pandemic or whatever these factors may be for you. When you do these things that raise all of this unsurety, if you will, it puts you in a lot more anxious state, which I think leads to you overestimating this type of reaction even more. So I think it's worth being aware of, like, based on how you are and what time it is in your life and things like that, that can all affect how much you assume things like this, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember that there was very little downside if you thought it was a tiger and it turned out to be a goose. There was a lot of downside if you thought it was a goose and it turned out to be a tiger. So we've had a million years of evolutionary selection to say, let's just think they're tigers. Which is great in the savannah, not so great in, metropolis, because there are so many things that can trigger that anxiety. And so you end up in this like constant state of being concerned about things. And that has all sorts of other bad knock-on effects. One of the things that I've found helpful is when you feel afraid of something, to acknowledge that fear is actually trying to help you. Right? It's there saying, hang on, I'm concerned about this thing because I perceive it as a threat to me. And so like saying like, thank you, fear, you're trying to protect me. I appreciate that. Thank you for that reference. Now can I look at the thing that you're saying you're concerned about and understand like how big a risk is this to me actually? And can I do anything about it? Like that's a big one. Because if you can do something about it, then do something about it and reduce your risk from that. But if you can't do anything about it, then you're at that point of like, well, if I keep worrying about it, does that help me at all? Probably not. So can I acknowledge that's a risk I'm going to have to face and do something to kind of let that fear know you've taken, like acknowledged, got it, done what I can. I'm going to move on now and spend energy in a place that's going to give me a better outcome than just worrying about this thing I can't change.
Yeah. And definitely reminds me of, I was not just one of a previous episode you came on, but multiple where we talked about how important it is to use those emotions and acknowledge those emotions. And then that combined with the fact of, hey, how is this going to change my outcome, my path of action? What am I going to do differently? So having kind of those two parts, like the first one is recognition, and I think is really important. So I want to restate what Alexandra said, which is paraphrasing, if you recognize that you're on edge or something feels off or weird, it's very possible that is coming from a place of fear. And so it's good for you to say, hey, okay, I can tell something's weird. Let me dig into that. Why is that? And especially if it's fear, okay, that is related to my fear of failure or my fear of, lack of recognition or whatever that fear may be. Okay, then now what are the steps I can do to either help ameliorate or get rid of that fear, or maybe recognize like, oh, that's actually not really that relevant here. That was just good old meat sack being a meat sack, doing those things that are hardwired in there. You know what I mean?
I like to do when I'm really angry is, or fearful, really, because anger and fear are very closely related, is jump on Twitter. I think that always helps. I mean, you want to know if I can do something about it, watch these tweets. Yeah, buddy.
And you used to only be able to have 120 characters. Now you have 240 characters.
So much more room to change the world.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're worried about something medical, Googling that always makes you feel better.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, that's how I figured out this bump here, was going to make my nose fall off.
Oh, I thought that bump was your nose.
Oh, thank you. Oh, got him. Great tone on that one.
Thanks.
So there's some of the things that I'll say are maybe a little more obvious, involving numbers, analytics, statistics, things like that. But if you were to peel the onion back another layer and try and dig one layer deeper, are there any other things that kind of come to mind, or maybe something that's once removed?
So one of the things that's interesting is, of course, like when you use data, if you lean on the Cheshire Cat, right? Alice is lost, and she asks the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go? And he says, well, where are you trying to get to? And she says, I'm not sure. And he goes, then it doesn't much matter which way you go. And with data, it's that way, right? Like if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't much matter which data you use. And so actually, like, one of the core tenets of using data-driven decisions is you have to understand the outcome that you want before you even apply data. And then you have the direction you're going and then your constraints, right? So it becomes an optimization problem, which is I need this outcome and I'm limited by these things. And that's very much an engineering mindset, but I find that it actually is incredibly useful in so many of the things that you do through your life, in terms of understanding, all right, one, do I know where I'm trying to get to? Like, what actually is my goal? Do I have an intent and a destination in what I'm trying to arrive at? And then understanding that there might not be a perfect way to achieve that. And that optimization is a perfectly acceptable measure of success, right? Like I did it as good as I could with the constraints that I had, and understanding trade-offs. So like risk reduction is a big thing in that space. That's like a really uncomfortable place for people to think about, right? Like I want the safe option. Well, maybe there's not a safe option. So can we find like the least risky that still gets you where you need to go? And one of the things that I was thinking about is co-sleeping. So
Say that again.
when you have
Co-sleeping?
Co-sleeping. So when you have a baby, you will be told 1,000 times, do not sleep with this baby. Do not. Right? You will roll over and suffocate it, or the baby will suffocate in your bed. Like the baby will die. It's sort of like Mean Girls, right? You will catch syphilis and die. Like, do not co-sleep, your baby will die. And so like with my first one, like religious, never did that. And, one of my sisters-in-law had a baby, and like she was sort of experimenting with co-sleep, and I was like, how could you do that? That's like akin to murder. Then my second showed up. And it turns out when you have two, they don't always sleep at the same time. And as a mom, when Chris went back to work, I'm on my own with two, and I was sleeping like 2 hours a day. And you're not functional on 2 hours of sleep a day, right? Like it's dangerous to drive when you have slept for 2 hours every day for the last 3 weeks. And so I was at this position where I was actually falling asleep, like holding my little baby in incredibly dangerous position, right? And so what I did is I then looked at all the research about co-sleeping. And it turns out that like if you're obese, if you're using illicit drugs, if you smoke, those are where you have the biggest risks with co-sleeping. But if you sleep on the floor and you get rid of all of your big blankets, like you can make co-sleeping a lot less dangerous, right? There's still risks. But what I came up with is if I'm going to fall asleep while driving, or I'm going to fall asleep sitting in the armchair, which is not a safe place to be with my baby, those are risks that are already happening. So can I then figure out, can I do this thing that's less optimal, but may actually overall reduce the risk of something bad happening to my baby? And it was like this hard thing because I had such this like hard line of you do not do this thing. And yet I couldn't make my life work. Right. And so I had to kind of let go of my like moral high ground and be like, okay, how am I going to find the safest of the options that's going to keep everybody like alive and me from going absolutely insane? So that was kind of an example of you have to know where you're trying to get to, like what actually is your goal. It's not don't co-sleep, it's keep my baby as safe as possible. And then you kind of come back into, all right, given the fact that I still need more than 2 hours of sleep every 24 hours, I've got 2 kids, they don't sleep at the same times. What do I do about that? And so you can kind of come up with the optimal solution based on that.
Yeah, so I am sitting here thinking, for you, it turned out that co-sleep was better than no sleep. So
Wasn't that?
that's good. But yeah, of course, I appreciate it to point out some of the ways you leverage your knowledge and experience in this. Is like, okay, you said, all right, people said this is the thing that you should or shouldn't do, and you decided to go and look at the sources, probably up to the primary source, and not just, oh, what did this secondary source, meaning like primary source is the ones who are actually doing the research and writing the paper on it. Secondary would be like the periodical or the newspaper or whatnot that's saying,
Or
Or your
even a
pediatrician.
doctor.
or a doctor, yeah, or a friend or someone who says like, oh, this is what this study said. Well, first thing, Alexandra's probably done more than most people in their lives. Has said, oh, I'm gonna go look up that study, and looked at that
Read the
actual
study.
study, right? And you, because of your skills, were able to look through that and read and understand what
Yeah.
they were saying. Now, it's worth pointing out that yes, technical papers aren't exactly the best to be reading, most exciting.
It's not really a page turner
It's-
usually.
yeah, and I'm hoping that shifts over time, and people realize like, hey, we can have technical conversations without being boring and dry. But it's still working on that one. But I guess my point is an average person can read a technical paper. It just may be a little harder to extract the certain things.
Yeah.
But it's also something with practice. The more you do, you know, okay, I need to look at this section for that, look at this section for that, and things like that. So you did that, and you looked into the risks of this co-sleeping and how to minimize them for yourself. And I'm sitting here, I can't help but think about episode 59 where we had you on and we were talking about micro-COVIDs. And we were pointing out like, hey, no huge alert needed here. Every day you are doing things that have some sort of risk to your health, to your life or whatnot. And we've been living this way for forever. It's just now
Not possible to live any other way.
right. It just happens to be right now there is a new thing, and it has a higher percentage chance of hurting you or making you sick or killing you or others than we're used to in our modern society, right? And so you said with the co-sleeping, like, hey, here's another way where I could kill my baby somehow, just like I could kill him when I'm driving down the street or walking down the stairs and falling asleep on the stairs or whatever, any one of these ways. And so you decided to lower the weighting of that co-sleep a little bit, and also maybe recognize like, hey, if I'm not high or drunk or some way impairing myself, if I happen to, you know, somehow nudge or roll over my baby, maybe my those hardwired instincts will come in a little bit. And sure, maybe one out of I don't know what number, I'm not even going to make one up, will have something happen to them, and that's horrible. But that's a risk that you decided to take, and it helped you sleep, and it helped you get to where you are today. And now you have a sarcastic boy. So I think it's a win-win.
Yeah, I really liked your move there of saying like the goal is not whether or not you get COVID, or it's not whether or not you co-sleep with your baby. The overall goal is safety, right? And sort of moving back out, like
Survival.
survive. Like there's this kind of thing of, you know, sort of being able to move out of the current predicament, because so much of the argument gets caught up in the nuances of that particular argument. And I remember having a conversation with somebody, and they were going on and on about the details of certain kinds of guns. And so we could never have the meta conversation about guns in general because we got so bogged down in the details.
Yeah.
And I find that to happen quite a bit, is it, especially when you bump into somebody very knowledgeable about a topic, they go down in the details and we forget why we're even there.
Right. Well, and I think recognizing the goal is also important because you guys might have different goals. So you get nowhere when you argue about policy and you guys have different goals that you're aiming for. Right. And which one's your goal versus which one's your constraint. So like gun control is a really good one because like you can say, is your goal to have the most number of people be alive? Right. And then there's a certain set of facts and things that you would argue and debate and look at policies for with that one. Or is your goal to say we want to have, the freest society while minimizing, so our constraint is harm to people, but our goal is freedom. Versus the other one is like our goal is security and our constraint is, how comfortable are we limiting people's freedoms? And people forget that those would be completely different sets of arguments, and therefore different policies would accomplish those different things. And so they just like yell at each other like, well, your policy won't work. The other person's like, yes, mine will, because their policy would work to achieve the thing they want within the constraints they're seeing. And then your policy is going to achieve the thing that you want within the constraints you're seeing, but you guys aren't pointed in the same direction.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the more I got into business, before I even started this, is something that's always been interested in me. That was a lovely sentence. But something that has always interested me in reading books, listening to podcasts, learning how businesses were founded, things like that. And figuring out, okay, what makes them run, how do they run, and what are they trying to accomplish? Well, a big part of that is figuring out the mission, the vision, the strategy, and looking at a plan forward, right? What does the next month look like? What does the next year or 5 years? So those type of things. And it's funny because, admittedly, maybe something like this exists that I'm not aware of, but it would be interesting to see, and if either of y'all know more than me, with the U.S. government, for example, it's like, hey, let's just go off, have a offsite for a week without all the media, without all those things and hoopla, and say, what are the things we want to accomplish together as a government, and then we can announce what those things are, and then we could go and try and work towards those things instead of what we're doing instead a lot of times is arguing past each other and trying to accomplish our thing exactly. And it's like, why not just get rid of that whole facade and then go for the middle?
Well, and there's we don't need to go into it too far, but we're also representative, right? Democracy.
Right.
So our leaders need to be tied to the voice of the people. And so there's this interesting idea that if they went off alone, we'd be like, what are they doing? They're not listening to me. So they're in trouble no matter what.
I'm going to have to leave because I'm going to have to go rescue my husband. But the last thing that I was saying is this is how I've always wished that government could work, which is you vote for somebody who represents the outcome that you want. Right? And so then they go and they advocate for that outcome. And then they all, everyone's representatives get together and they come up with, okay, like what actually is the outcome that we're aiming for? And how do we know we've gotten there or that we're getting there, right? So there's some like metric associated or goalposts set so that you can know you're on your way to that outcome. And then you go to people who actually work in that area and you say, I don't care what you want to do. This is what we've been told and we've all decided this is the outcome we're going for. What would get us there the best? And you try that policy. And you have those checkpoints in place. So it's like the legislators would not vote on the actual policies. They would vote on the outcomes. And then people who understand that and are experienced in there could suggest policies and say, these policies we think would get us to the outcome you've said you need. And then you would be able to check, like, are we getting there or not? Yes or no? No, new policy. But Chris always pats me on the head and says, that's so cute that you think that's how government work.
Well, one thing we're going to have to hear the story of another day was if you had a giant weighted pros cons list that you had before you got married, because I'm curious to know,
Is the patting on the head in there?
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alexandra. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Oh. Wrong button. There we go. So for those of you who are not aware, that was Alexandra Mannerings, and her company is Merakinos, MERAKINOS.com. We'll drop that in the chat. And she also has a podcast called Heart, Soul, and Data. And what her business is she helps small businesses and entrepreneurs and nonprofits figure out their data analytics journey. And one of the things that comes across in her podcast, it's come across from me talking with her over the last handful of months, is she's very important for people to figure out where they're trying to go. And I thought that Cheshire Cat quote was amazing. It's like, hey, well, which way do I go? And she's like, well, where are you trying to get to? And it's like, I don't know. Well, then it doesn't much matter which way you're going. And I was like, yeah, that's great. And how many people live their lives that way, right? It's like, I don't know what I'm going to do or where I'm going to go. But yet now I'm surprised when some of the steps I'm going are in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Well, and one of the books I've read talks a lot about the decisions that we make. If we don't make them for ourselves, somebody else will make them for you. And it will be in their best interest where you go, right? So if you ask the media at large what you should do with your life, they will have answers for you, right? And they probably, in the long term, are not going to be super beneficial for you because the goals belong to other people, right? So this is also something that gets involved in politics, but it's very difficult within sort of a consumerist society when we keep relinquishing certain abilities to sort of make our own thoughts or decisions, and we reference other thoughts that are already out there for us. decisions that are pre-packaged and these identities that are pre-packaged
Right.
ready to go. So not that I don't think any of us think we're falling for those, but we probably are.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, I mean, it's kind of like if you know nothing else, the easy thing to do is what does that other person do, say, or think that I agree with a lot of the time, right? But then you lose some of the nuance, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, and I would enjoy having that conversation or debate with some people in the politics world about
Oh, yeah.
that outcome based model. I feel like that would be an interesting thing to try.
You know, if we had more time, and maybe we'll bring it up next time, but there's also this kind of difficulty of once we put outcomes on things, that's a type of incentive that often has led historically to really bad things happening, right? Because people achieve the outcome at any cost. And so, yes, you can hit these metrics. So then how do you bracket enough of this information to make sure that you don't do damage along the way to get to these outcomes? So there's this kind of problem there where when you start getting into utility, right, where things become efficient and there's kind of a utilitarian bent, we're just going to achieve this, then once again, people forget the oversight, the larger picture of maybe this is actually about safety, not achieving this one singular goal.
Yeah. It certainly gets complicated really fast. And also, it's worth pointing out that, you know, our governing body is a couple of hundred of people representing over 300 million people, which I think is something that people don't think about that often. Like, just how big of a scale difference there is. It's like 300 is like 10 to the 2 scale, whereas a million is 10 to the 6 or 7. Or sorry, it's 300 million rather. So it's, I don't know, 10 to the 9 or something like that. It's that many times bigger, which is easy to forget about because, one, it started out a lot smaller.
Yeah.
But two, since we feel so connected to it, like back in the day, it was like, oh, you want to know what happens? It's like, well, let me ride a horse for, 2 weeks in a carriage and go get to the spot. And then maybe I'll get handed out a piece of paper that somebody, printed on, letting me know what happened.
Yeah, and also, when the population was smaller, having 300 people, let's say serve 3 million, that meant that there is this kind of capacity to better understand what people are thinking and talking about in your sort of local area. So when you are a representative that shows up, you know a larger percentage of the population personally. That continues to sort of, I don't know, dissolve as the population grows.
Yeah, for sure. So as we were talking about Alexandra and some of the things that ways she applies her expertise in her life, one, was there any particular one she said that either resonated with you or you were surprised of or you found really valuable? Or
we talked a little bit about some of the things before, so but the co-sleeping thing was all new to me. I was completely unaware of that, and also the idea that you need to, like, when doctors give you really hard advice, she's like, well, yes, but, like, let's dig. And I found that to be kind of interesting. At some point she was like, overall safety is not based around this one little pocket of safety. And it almost feels to me that's almost like legalistic, right? That the doctor has to say these things, and so they're adamant about them.
Well, that's the other thing too to consider is when you are making these kind of decrees, these public ways of like, hey, this is what you should do, you have to keep in mind that that is aimed at the average person. And it's also recognizing that, hey, not every person's going to go read into the literature. Not every person's going to figure out all of the things you can do to make it slightly more safe. Not all, all of these type of, and not everyone is going to take that as a hard and fast rule, right? Maybe they'll be like, okay, well, this is the rule. Well, if I do this much of it, I'll probably be okay, right? So as a policymaker, as someone who's, putting these things out into the world or doing a study or whatnot, that kind of influences your recommendations a little bit. It's like, all right, if I'm picturing Aunt Susie as I'm making this recommendation, well, maybe it ends up being a little stricter or whatever because you recognize that the average person isn't going to fully understand this, isn't going to look into it. And so in general, when it comes to things that have been decreed from down above or from studies or whatnot, it's going to be going towards the stricter side of things versus the looser side of things. And I don't have anything to back that up, but one thing that certainly I think about a lot, especially is like, all right, hey, if you have this knowledge and this information about how things are and what they should be, it's like, okay, should you just let everyone have that knowledge and do what they will with it, or assuming that they are going to process it and do the work and all that kind of stuff? Or do you kind of say like, hey, here's the bulk of it, and if you guys want to go dig into it more, you can, but here's what our recommendation is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has had a chance to watch Don't Look Up on Netflix.
Not yet, but I want to. Is it good?
Yeah, because it sort of falls into this thing where, they can say something and say, this is definitely happening, and people are just like, meh. And so that's another sort of facet of it is oftentimes we'll give people these very firm kind of statements, and yet people will not believe them. And it's not until it's in their best interest somehow to believe it that they actually take it onto themselves. So there ends up becoming these kind of like media campaigns around getting people to believe things. It's a kind of Edward Bernays propaganda kind of issue of like, how do you, because propaganda wasn't originally always a bad word. It was to propagate, it was to spread information. And even the Catholic Church would propagate information outwards, right? So it wasn't technically supposed to be a bad term, but it became that because you started having to manipulate people to get them to believe things. So when we come into these like hard stances like that, you can tell people 100 times, don't do this, don't drink and drive. And yet, people still will. And so there is this kind of thing about, I wonder how much just being adamant is working, because it doesn't seem to actually work. Maybe it does. I don't know. I'm just throwing out things.
You seem pretty adamant about that.
I am adamant about not knowing.
What does Adam have to do with this, anyways?
Adam Ant. It's a guy I know.
Or is that what Adam meant?
Oh, maybe he did. What did? Oh no, now I'm confused.
So, what about for you in your life, Ryder? Are there certain things from, you had a useless degree. I mean, just a master's in fine art. Like, how do you even apply that, right? I mean, does that have any impact on your everyday life? I mean, surely it can't.
Well, it does since I've started having this podcast where we can talk about meaningless things.
Oh, perfect. Assigning meaning to things you do.
Ding, ding. That's what I'm best at. Yeah, I think that there's little things about having this sort of the education that I have that is really, I've always kind of thought that colleges should be more about learning how to think and learning how to process information. And it's interesting when we go off into technical side of it, because of course that's great, but that technical side is always changing. The thing that would help you handle that technical information better is maybe having classes in logic or symbology or something like this that could actually, maybe even philosophy or something like that. So one of the things about having an art degree is we mostly critiqued other people's work, right? That was a large portion of it. So somebody shows up with something, we sit around and talk about what's working and not working about that thing. And so I think in that way, an art education actually provides you with a lot. It just doesn't provide you in skills that people claim that they want, right? Which is technical skills. People want good, compliant, passive workers who have technical skills. And even though they claim they want innovation, a lot of companies don't want innovation. They want the credentialed degree. They want the great resume. But once you get in there, you're not supposed to actually be creative or have these wonderful ideas. You're just supposed to plug into the system and be a great cog.
Yeah, being a cog in the machine. No, I I do think that is a good point. I don't know if I've thought about or realized just how much the critical examination aspect would be a factor in art education, and it makes complete sense, right? You want to be able to analyze and look at all the different styles, all the different artists, and see what you can learn from the things that they've done, how you can kind of snag this, and apply that into your own style, perhaps. And then when you and your other students, I guess, are going through this and analyzing works and talking about them, and just that aspect of hearing what people are thinking and talking it out, like that kind of helps shape how you design things in the future, and knowing like, all right, here's kind of some of the thoughts, and here's some of the techniques that come to mind, things like that. And yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, and it sounds like it makes for a lot of really good armchair quarterbacks, I would say.
Oh yeah, it does, and that's, which is which is fine because we're all sort of doing that anyway. We just all couch it differently.
Yeah,
And
nice.
so-
Wow, two furniture pieces in one
Yeah,
sentence.
there
I
you
like
go.
it.
Bam.
Oh man, I don't know how to chase that one, to be honest.
Go deep.
So you've got kind of the critical eye and maybe ear aspect of it. Were there other things that you kind of find yourself using or thinking about, if not on a daily basis, but maybe every now and then?
Oh, it's when I bump into things that are not considered. The interesting thing about putting an art piece out into the world is you're expecting it to get critiqued. You're expecting people to have opinions about it, or to tear it apart, or to love it, whatever it is. And the idea that I bump into, not all the time, but quite frequently, is people that put things out into the world and then don't know why it didn't get the reaction they thought it would get. And I want to think, like, how unaware are you? Like, this is part of a larger conversation, and yet they will do things and put things out there, and then when they don't get the reaction they want, that they're completely baffled by this. And I just have to think to myself, man, I guess going through art school for all those years, everything that I put out into the world, you knew there was going to be reaction and conversation around. And that's actually kind of a very lovely pocket to exist in, where you're having lots of conversation around your efforts. Once you get out of that pocket, it's harder to have those conversations because you had dedicated focus from all these people that their degree depended on it. But I do find that there are still people that will make sort of unilateral decisions without thinking about the outcome, and I find that to be really baffling. So that's one of the things I bump into very frequently. I could go off into aesthetic stuff, like, I'm sorry, but no, a garage door will never look good. Like, especially, why do you put it in the front of your house? This will never be a good idea, right? I have these kind of aesthetic problems all the time when walking or driving around.
Well, Ryder, you see what you're doing there is you were optimizing for the larger group. They were optimizing for themselves. They don't have to look at their garage all the time.
No, because they're inside.
They're inside, and they're in the backyard, enjoying the backyard and the side yards, and the front is what everyone else has to look at.
Yeah, I know. Take that, world.
So what were you optimizing for that was a little different?
I was optimizing for me.
Please change your house so it looks better from my eyes.
Yes, please.
So one of the things that I do and think of is being like hyper analytical and noticing all of the small things, and especially now with my job, trying to find all the things that when it comes to a tool, for example. If I had $1 every time I said, oh, it really should do this or have this feature, surely it does that. And then it's like, nope, it doesn't do that. I'm really good at finding all of those things.
Oh, yeah.
And so that, and then I would just say, yeah, thoughtful design, I think, is a big thing for me that I've picked up, especially over the last few years, but I feel like it's kind of always been there. And, we've talked about poke-yoke before, and now every time I see something that doesn't have that, I'm like, why could you not design this better? And then also another thing, talking about scale and like people not realizing the impact their decisions have. I think that all the time when with some of these mass tools, like things like YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, like at the end of the day, it's easy to forget, but those are decisions made, again, by a small number of people. And it's like, hey, I need to design this way. Marketing tells me I should do it this way so we can maximize this or whatever. But then they're making that change and literally having billions of man hours of effect on the world. Because now, for example, one of my least favorite design decisions that's existed in the digital world is when it's on an iOS device, at least, when you click on a link within an app, it pops up a browser inside that app. And I don't know why that's valuable. The only thing I'm thinking about that whole time is, okay, this is a browser. This app launched so they can take my data. By the way, none of that goes to my history, I don't think. And so now it's less ideal for me as a user. Oh, if I have to enter a password and maybe that browser doesn't work as well as the actual fully fledged one. It's like I have all of these issues. So now every time I get a link, I have to click through and then click to go to Safari and then do the thing. And sometimes it's one of those temporary pages that only loads for a second. And then when you try and open it again, it's like, you can't load that. You've already loaded that page. Yeah. I'm like, ah!
Yes, I do this a lot. And of course, all these decisions are once again being made for us by people who are profiting from those decisions. It's not about the user at the end of the day. It's about keeping you on platform, controlling your data, once you stay on platform, they can track all your data. Once you hop over to Safari, they lose the ability to track you. So, these decisions are made for them, and yet we using these systems are part of them. One of the things that I really despise was when Instagram made it harder to just post a regular image because they're driving everyone towards stories and reels. And so they've changed the way that the layouts work, and all of a sudden they've shifted things that were at the bottom up to the top, so you have to move your fingers upwards to tap on them. So just this is what's interesting about UI design is they want to place the directions they want you to travel as close to your thumbs as possible. The more you have to reach, the less often you're going to do it. That's how lazy humans are. So they just build the entire user interface around what they desire from you. So when they shifted everything around, I was like, oh man, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to play your game, right?
Did you flip your phone upside down?
Yeah.
That's why Ryder's Instagram is all upside down pictures now.
Sorry, everybody.
But I'm sticking it to the man. I'll show them.
Yeah, no one cares. Like that's the other funny thing is we all get retrained so easily. Which is also in a sort of political sense, it's one of the things that kind of tends to happen, right? They just push and then retreat and push and retreat, and they eventually end up getting where they want to go because that was one of the things with facial recognition. When it originally came out, there was a big hubbub. Everyone hated the idea of having their face recognized, and Facebook was automatically tagging you in photos, and people thought it was super creepy. Well, then they said, well, how about you tag yourself in photos? They just waited a year and said, why don't you tag yourself in photos? And then people started doing it for free, thinking it was a great idea. And it was like, oh my God, it's the exact same thing. They just repackaged it and gave it back to us in a different way.
Yeah, now you're doing the work and you're still giving them the data. So
yes, yeah, I know. And you have consented to the whole thing.
Oh, and by the way, like, you think they stopped doing that analysis? No, they just stopped showing you.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So if we were to kind of abstract it a little bit and try and think about for an average person at home, how can they leverage some of the skills that they've gained from their education or from their work into their everyday life? What do you have any thoughts on how someone might do that?
I mean, we're probably all doing it all the time. If you have education and work, it probably has already shaped you. So one of the things that it's great talking with Alexandra about is that she's aware of what she's doing, right? So we're talking about being aware of when you're doing these things and sort of going, oh, this is a decision I made because this is the field that I'm in. So oftentimes I think we're already doing it. So the biggest issue there is when you go to the grocery store, right? Whenever you get on your bicycle to go somewhere or whatever the heck you're doing, I don't know, planning a route. Like, what kind of thoughts are going through your head, and think to yourself, I wonder if my job or my education has somehow influenced the way I'm making this decision right now.
Yeah. So again, it may seem simplistic, but it seems like it's pretty much just awareness. And then maybe even giving yourself the prompt, like, okay, hey, what are some things I know that could help me in this situation? And right now we're looking at it through the lens of your education or your work, but certainly there's things you picked up elsewhere, right? From a friend or from a movie, from a book, from a podcast, whatever, like from an amazing show where they tell you how to live your life and make it better every single day, wherever you may be learning these things, right? But what is something that I've picked up on or I've heard or I've learned that could help me make this decision? And maybe that's as I'm sitting there trying to make a decision in the grocery store about what I buy. Maybe that's deciding to go to an earlier movie in the day to save a little money versus going to one at night. Or maybe it's, anything, right? The possibilities really are endless, but it's like, okay, I had this job studying art, or I had this job analyzing data, or I had this job where I had to deal with people all day. Well, what have I learned and gained from that experience that I can then leverage to make my life better, make my life easier?
Yeah.
And I feel like if you're doing that on a regular basis, your life's going to be better and your life's going to be easier, and maybe you'll save some money, and maybe you'll have all these other improvements as well.
Yeah, and the other great thing about that is realizing if you had a different job, you would probably have different ways of moving through the world. If you had a different education as well. And some of that comes back to just like whenever other people don't handle a situation the way you do, be curious. just be like, oh, well, I wonder why they made that decision.
Right.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have made that decision.
No, and I do that all the time. And I ask, and we've even mentioned on the show, I'll ask Danielle, like, oh, so why'd you do it that way? And sometimes it's because most of the times with her, it's like, oh, I wasn't really thinking about it as much as you were. Classic. But and sometimes it's like,
everything.
oh, I was doing it because of ABC. And then sometimes like, oh, that's okay. That makes sense. Thanks for letting me know. Or it's like, oh, okay. And maybe if it's something I didn't want her to do, it's like, okay, well, what can I shift around here to maybe influence her or decide, help her do that thing in an easier way or a cleaner way or whatever the thing might be, right? If we're talking about, say, for example, stuff around the house. So yeah, I think the first step is just asking yourself, hey, what are the things I can do? And also if you're sitting there and you're like, I can't think of a lot of things that are helping me with this right now. I mean, that's okay. Like, not everyone has that education or work that does transfer that easily, but I imagine that most things that people do, whether it's something a basic entry-level job or a CEO type of thing, anywhere along that spectrum, you're learning something, right? You're gaining some skills that can be leveraged in some way. And I would say it's probably not as correlated with money as some people might initially think. I could also say the opposite, right? You see some of these people who go through life with a bunch of money, and then they have like no street smarts, right? Because they've not had to apply any of that stuff. Oh, that's just something I paid a person to do.
Yeah. No, there's always I mean, at the end of the day, we're in a world now where you can't really know everything. And so you're going to have certain perspectives you're coming from. Widening those out is great, but also, yeah, if you have to live multiple lives, because that's what it starts sounding like. Like you've got to live multiple lives to get all these perspectives so that you can understand how this works. And that's just difficult and it's time consuming. It's like we're all like a sociologist while we're doing our main job.
Right. And well, which brings up the point, which I don't think we've mentioned exactly yet, which is, hey, recognizing that as you're doing this exercise, as you're trying to think about how you can better leverage things, and how you can view things a little differently. Well, guess what? That's influencing how everybody is going through the world and how they're viewing things and seeing things. So, oh, yeah, like Ryder is saying, if they do something or say something that's completely out of left field or completely different from what I was thinking and doesn't make any sense to me, instead of first rushing to judgment, right? It's like start from curiosity and be like, oh, well, why is that? And why do you think? Because, yeah, maybe you'll completely disagree with that person, but maybe then you'll learn another aspect about it or an angle that they're coming at it at. And maybe that'll help you learn a little bit more. If nothing else, you'll learn a little bit more about them. But also maybe it'll help you understand why and how people are thinking as a whole, which honestly is one of the big goals with Helpful for Life, but also the show is to help encourage people to think for themselves, to rediscover that brain that they have. And, oh, by the way, that means sometimes turning off all of these outside influences and encouraging yourself to just think, right? And turning off the podcast, turning off the TV, turning off the spouse and the kids, and getting some time to yourself. Maybe go walk in a park and just be with your thoughts and start to think about things and process things, you know?
Yeah, it's you're gonna have to block off time for this, and you're gonna have to be disciplined about it. It's not gonna. You could do it in an afternoon, but I think you're gonna see the biggest benefits if you do it long term.
And you're not going to necessarily feel that change. I mean, let me rephrase. You're going to probably feel some friction, especially if this is something that you don't do often, but it's kind of like a muscle. Like, yeah, there's a little bit of pain, but you're going to get some growth from it. And the more you use it, the stronger it'll get, the easier it'll come to you. And then you'll be able to do it more without having to necessarily isolate yourself completely and remove yourself and get rid of all the distractions. But the reality is if you do take that step and you kind of move in that direction, you might realize like, okay, maybe I should turn down the noise a little bit where I can, to help me better think and process, to live a better, smarter, cheaper, life. More.
Yeah, let's add some in there. Get our lives a little
Exactly. Well, any other last thoughts for us today on this topic?
No, I think that was good. Yeah.
Well, cool. So today we talked about leveraging your work, your education, your experiences, and using that in your everyday life. And we talked with our guest, Alexandra Mannerings of Merakinos, and she does data analytics. And we're like, hey, okay, you've got data analytics, you've got a science background, got a really nerdy family, it sounds like. How do you leverage all of those skills that you've developed into your everyday life? And so she talked with us about how she looks at statistics completely differently, correlation versus causation, things like that. And also she pointed out, hey, some of these traps that we fall into, I still fall into myself. I'm just a little better at recognizing it and then maybe then changing my action afterwards. Yeah. And so that's one of the ways that she leverages some of her experience, right? And we also talked about Ryder and his art and his education and how that kind of helped shape the way that you think and you criticize, and also shape the way you created, because like, hey, if I'm going to create something and put it out there, like, I'm expecting a bunch of criticism, right? One thing we didn't mention in that discussion was, hey, you're doing that in front of some group of people, and you're going to get some group of reactions. But if you show that to a different group of people or a larger group of people, you're going to have some different things, right? And maybe some people will like it more. Certainly some people will hate it more, and there's all types of things in between as you start to get more of those perspectives in there and more of those views and things like that. So we talked a little bit about that. And then, here we are.
Yeah. We'll have to. So challenge today: be aware whenever you're moving through the world, and something with your job or education influences the way you're thinking or processing or making a decision in the moment. Just sort of pause and be like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing that because." I think that's just a great spot to sort of start with these things, to sort of realize the way our brains are trained and the way we're behaving is based on that training.
Yeah. So be aware when you recognize that your work, your education, your skills are being used in these everyday situations. And the next step along those lines is to ask yourself that question. Hey, if I'm not using this, how can I do that that might make things better in some way? And then, as you're moving along this path, I think the next step is to talk with someone about that, especially if someone is in a completely different background than you, right? So it's like, I have a highly analytical, technical background, very different from my wife, Danielle. And so when I tell her, like, oh, well, here's this thing, here's how I looked at it, here's all the ways I analyzed this thing, she's a lot of times like, oh, well, never thought about any of that. So having that conversation and being like, hey, here's how I view this, here's the way I process it, that can be valuable in and of itself and could lead to some interesting conversations as well.
Yeah. I mean, why not? Let's diversify our point of view.
I like it. Well, let us know in the chat what you guys think, and let us know as you're moving through your life some of the ways that you have leveraged your experiences. You can also contact us at helpfulforlife.com. Hit the contact us button in the top right. But with that, we've got a recap. We've got a challenge. All we need now is for you to show us your tail.
Cut.
Another day then. Another day then. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful hump day.
Bye.